Move on. If you see people out there in the hallway, maybe pull them in. We're gathering everybody back up. Trust me, we're getting toward the end. This is the final stretch here, guys. Okay, look, just while I have you, just a logistical announcement here. Okay, come on, quiet down, let's go. So a logistical announcement. So we are having our final session on autonomous mobility, automated mobility. It's going to be great. What's going to happen is right after this final session, we are all going to go downstairs and we're going to get into 2 buses that are waiting for us. And those buses are going to drive across the Charles River, and we're going to have a reception with some of the startups over at the MIT campus. So that's the kind of final chapter. So I don't know about any of you, but I could kind of use a glass of wine. So, this would be, that's what we have to look forward to. That's how I'm going to entice you to get into these buses. Okay, let's go into the final topic, which I think is something that has been on everyone's mind. So early last week, on a highway outside of New Orleans, a kind of super fog suddenly settled onto the highway, and there was a remarkably horrible 168 car pileup. People couldn't see, and 8 people were killed. This just happened early last week. I'm sure many of you saw this on the news. And so the thought experiment that I would pose to this room is, when you consider the current state of even just level 2 autonomous technology, the thought experiment is, had those vehicles been driving with current level 2 technology, would we have had such a catastrophic outcome? And I don't know what the answer is, but then of course you can ask the next question, and what about in 2 years' time? And what about in 2 years' time? So automated mobility is a topic that I think, so many sides of the equation. But let me start by introducing Mark Rosekind. And Mark is joining us from California. I first met Mark in Washington, D.C. in his office when he was the administrator of NHTSA. And then he went from there, from NHTSA, to become the chief safety officer at Zoox, an automated mobility company. So we're speaking to somebody who's been on both sides, on the government regulatory side and on the business side. But what I also find really interesting about Mark is that he's been on the automotive side, but also on the aviation and aerospace side, and has some interesting viewpoints on that. And we thought it would be great, before we get into the panel, just to hear a couple of thoughts and reflections on what's going on out there in the automated mobility space from Mark. So I don't see an image of Mark. Oh, yes, I do. There he is. Yep. Hey, Mark, how are you? You can hear us okay?
All good.
Wonderful. Okay, we're going to turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, John. And my first thing is just to thank you for the invite and opportunity to talk to everybody. And obviously, what's really great is the flexibility that you're able to provide as well. So let me just check. We have slides up. Let's start here. The title had to do with reflections, but I wanted all of us to realize reflections is a way for us to lead into lessons learned. And the lessons learned really matter when we can take those lessons and turn them into actions. And so I only have barely 10 minutes here. And I want us to talk not just about what we've learned, but how we turn it into actions that actually make us safer on the roads. And so I want to ground us first for a safety discussion with some bent metal. And I'm saying that because it's so easy for us to start talking about engineering and code and sensors, et cetera. And sometimes we leave too quickly from not just the numbers, but the reality of what's going on. This was a distraction crash that was investigated by the NTSB. That SUV literally flipped 180 degrees in the air and landed on the roof of that white minivan. This was another distraction crash that was investigated by the NTSB. A young man was on his phone in his pickup. He hit that truck tractor. I don't know if you can see it, but the bus crushed his vehicle. He lost his life as well as a student who was in the very back of the bus there. And this remains the most lethal alcohol-related crash in the United States. You can see how many people lost, with the driver who was over 3 times the legal limit. I wanted to ground us in reality. When we talk about safety, it starts here. And we go to the numbers, but it's always told people, know the exact number, because those are lives lost. Those are people. Those are your family, your community. Those are people. 118 people's lives are lost. That was from 2021, the last time we have final numbers. Everything since then are estimates. But 6 million crashes with over 2 million injuries and 118 people losing their lives every single day. And most people don't realize this, but 95% of the lives that are lost in transportation occur on our roadways. And this is one, sorry, human choices or errors. Yes, the next slide that everyone has to show is, so what's causing all of those? These are the top 3 that get discussed. I put the bottom one there because most people don't realize, even though it's not causal, that today about 91% of people are wearing seatbelts, but in crashes where people die, 51% of them have made the choice not to wear their seatbelt. So I think what's interesting, in spite of all the lives that have been lost, we know that technology can save those lives. This is a 2015 report that was done looking at airbags, 14 different technologies, airbags and seatbelts and federal motor vehicle safety standards over 50 years. And you can see 613,500 lives lost. And so we know for safety, technology can save lives. But I also like to point out, it takes decades sometimes for that transition to take place. One of my famous lines I like to say is, when your app crashes, nobody dies. When you apply that to road safety, it has more horrific outcomes. And we got to acknowledge that the complexity and dynamic environment of the roadways is much more than what we see here in the phone's evolution over time. And so what are we going to do about this? Basically, Einstein taught us, you want insanity? It's keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. And so that's why my title actually at Zoox was Chief Safety Innovation Officer. Where is the innovation in safety that we're going to get that's actually going to move us toward a more safe system here on our roadways? So what I've done now, we're going to go from context to some of the stakeholders, and I have 3 slides where I'm going to get more concrete, where we move from basically just lessons learned to what are some of the actions that we could take to actually see our system get safer. So let's start with the industry. And I've listed 5 things here, but I started with the fact that I think we need independent and neutral involvement of entities to attack every one of these that you see on the screen. Okay, independent and neutral. That could be academic environments like MIT, that could be other entities like MITRE, but we need independent and neutral entities that are going to partner with industry to address these things, starting with sharing safety data. This has been done in aviation, as science, for a long time now. And I have a philosophy that says never again. If someone dies in an autonomous vehicle crash, that data needs to be shared so that everybody learns from that horrific occurrence. We should not need companies to have their own tragic occurrences to learn from them. We need sharing of safety data. Everyone talks about data transparency. What I haven't seen are the conversations about what does that actually mean? That doesn't mean, I think, that we just throw everything at the public, throw everything at the academics, throw everything at everyone else in the industry. What does data transparency actually mean? We have the NTSB. I was a board member there for 5 years. We have NHTSA that looks after defect investigations, but every company should really have its own team that can look at crashes and incident investigations, again, hopefully partnering with independent neutral entities. And the reason for that is to identify what are the causal and contributing factors that can actually lead to improvements in the system. Really critical to understand so that changes get made so these things don't happen again. There are a lot of best practices being generated, but we need to audit them and really know who's doing what. They're being followed, and even more important, are those best practices actually allowing us to see safety being promoted and advanced in some way. The final thing on here is, nowadays it's possible to publish a blog, put out your publications, but in science, independent neutral peer review is required to go beyond just making claims or hypotheses. And let me just say, I think that's another shortcoming here as we move from lessons learned to actions. This slide talks about industry actions that could help advance safety. It starts with independent and neutral entities that partner with the industry to pursue the things that are on this slide. And I'm saying that because I think while it's great for developers, companies, et cetera, to have their own activities, having independent, neutral partners like academic environments, MIT, others, MITRE, et cetera, they would be really helpful. So the first one on here is sharing safety data. I'm a broken record on this. My philosophy is never again. If we should have a crash where someone's life is lost in an AV crash, then that should only happen literally once, which is we should all learn from that so that every company doesn't have to go through that horrific kind of tragedy. We should all be learning from that crash so that it never happens again. The whole idea is that we learn from it and then can prevent it from happening. Every company shouldn't have to go through it. Aviation's been doing it for decades already. It's called the science. Data transparency, everybody talks about that for trust. Nobody talks about what does it mean. It's not just dumping data for everybody to go after. It's like, what does that really mean? Every company should have their own entity that can look at crash and incident investigations. Yes, we have the NTSB. We have NHTSA. I spent 5 years at the NTSB as a board member. Critical, but they take a long time. They're very thorough. NHTSA is focused on their defect investigations. Companies need these independent, neutral entities to help them identify the causal and contributing factors so they know what to change to enhance safety. A lot of best practices being promoted. People are doing a lot of things. We need audits. Again, this has been going on in aviation forever. How do we know those best practices are actually being followed? And even more important, are they working or not? Because very often data-driven best practices lead to regulation. We got to know they're working. The last one on here is just, you have your own blog, you can publish whatever you want, but in science, we know independent, neutral peer review is required. There's a lot of claims, a lot of hypotheses, but without that kind of independent, neutral peer review, I'm not sure you can say that you've really got scientific and engineering fact going on. These are other stakeholders, which have to do with the government entities. And again, we've got 5 on this slide, and basically it starts with, at Department of Transportation, they have a national road safety strategy. Autonomous vehicles are not really in there. Federal, state, and cities, all of them should create their own strategic plan that is proactive, not just reactive. And I say that because right now we've seen things like emergency vehicles being compromised by AVs. And the reality is it'd be great to have the emergency responders community come up and say, we don't want you to do this, but here's the behavior we actually expect. Regulations, it's time. When we put out the first federal automated vehicle policy 7-8 years ago, people used to say, regulate, regulate what? Now we have enough going on. The regulatory process is long enough. We should get some of those things started. Federal, state, and city authorities really need to look at what their actual authorities are so they can determine how they can both support the development and deployment of AVs, as well as stop them when bad things are going on. The next one's really interesting, but there hasn't been a lot of discussions where federal, state, and cities get in the same room and decide what are our complementary roles here. NHTSA doesn't want to be a state Department of Motor Vehicles. DMV doesn't want to have to do what NHTSA's job is. And cities sometimes are stuck in the middle saying, and what do we do if the feds in the state are doing this kind of thing? We really need clear, explicit roles defined by these entities so people know what the expectations are. And the bottom line, again, is we don't want data redundancy. We don't want the same thing in investigations. And even in transparency, we got to know, what does that really mean? So among these stakeholders as well, there's a lot of action. For everybody, I just wanted to bring this up. Everyone talks about how safe is safe enough. I'm going to raise the question whether we've even defined that for the current road safety environment. I think that's one of the challenges. As hard as it's been to define what we want for safety in AVs, part of the struggle has been we haven't been explicit about what that means for the current road safety environment. And that includes NHTSA, who has an authority to pursue anything that represents an unreasonable risk to safety, but that's not really well defined. Great for the authority side, what does that mean? And that includes defining what the metrics are. Yes, we talk about crashes and injuries and fatalities, but what are the new metrics going to be as we're looking forward to safety? In California, they asked for disengagements, and you needed that to pursue your testing. The reality is, after a little while, we figured out disengagements may not be the best form of information, or did we even define it well? So again, what are the metrics going to be? And having been in the arena, let me just say, while we talk about all these sometimes more esoteric stuff, it comes down to very concrete things like, so when you remove the safety driver, what are the metrics and definitions that you're going to quantify to show it's okay to do that? So I'm just going to give some acknowledgement quickly and then finish with a couple slides, which is there's been a lot of good advancements. These are just 2 examples. You got to give SAEs, AV Safety Consortium a lot of credit because they've been developing all kinds of best practices. And I think we want to challenge them to say, what's next? Could they be part of the audit process or other things? And I just want to acknowledge California DMV. They wanted to come up with a pathway, not just regulation, but a pathway for deployment. And you got to give them a lot of credit for evolving and staying on top of it. Last two slides, very quickly. A crash is not an accident. And a lot of people look at this as a semantic discussion, but if you're in safety, you've got to believe that crashes are preventable. And that's really the crux, the core of being able to go after the causal and contributory factors. You can change them so whatever happened does not reoccur. A crash is not an accident. And I learned at the NTSB as a board member, you can have safety or you can have blame. And what that means is you've got to be able to identify those causal and contributory factors so that you know what to go after. And I'm saying that because there's been all this discussion about the human error piece. And let's be clear, 30 years ago as a NASA scientist, we acknowledged 80% of crashes and incidents were related to the human. The Institute of Medicine in 1999 basically said, you know what, 100,000 errors, medical errors every year because of the humans. Even the safe system basically acknowledges that human error, is one of the things we have to deal with, and the system should be resilient enough that that error shouldn't lead to death. And I bring this up because I call it safety misdirection. It's like decades old. You want to say, oh, you're just blaming the driver. It's really the car manufacturer. Oh, you're blaming the driver. Now they point to the AI. Blame doesn't get you safety. And yes, I think you could have discussions about how you apply the numbers, et cetera. But the key is, human error is the what, okay? And at the NTSB, I learned that's only part of the story. It's the why that matters. Why did that human error actually occur? How do we address that to get the safety that we actually want? So do you want safety? You can't deny what the actual contributory and causal factors are, but let's not use the blame and excuse and the denial not to go after the safety. If we do that, it's really bad for all of us. The last thing I'm just going to mention is, here's our close. This is still opportunity. We need to evolve the safety culture. We need to get more proactive rather than reactive. Aviation, they don't compete on safety. We need to see that on road safety, collaboration. And the final thing is, this is still opportunity. These are tools, and we need to figure out if those tools are going to give us the effect that we want, the value to our society and safety, and can we identify and acknowledge the new risks that they will introduce so we can address those as well. And I'm looking forward to the panel. Sorry about the technical, and look forward to chatting further.
Super. Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate that. Thank you.